The film opens in January 1995, introducing us to Roman, a highly principled and idealistic mathematics professor at a national university in South Korea. He was a dedicated teacher, but his career was soon on the line after a bitter conflict with the university administration. The president and several other professors wanted to manipulate student test scores to meet graduation quotas, a practice that was considered business as usual. Roman, however, refused to sign off on the fabricated grades. His stubborn refusal was seen as a major disruption to the system. He was accused of being uncooperative and violating internal rules. As a result, the university unjustly fired him, leaving Roman feeling a profound sense of injustice. He eventually moved to the United States and found work as a lecturer, but he never forgot the injustice he faced. A decade later, in 2005, the South Korean government passed a new law that allowed wrongfully dismissed faculty to seek a reassessment of their cases. This gave Roman hope, and he convinced his wife, Lucy, to return to Korea with him. She was hesitant, still angry about the way the university had treated him, but his desire to return to his home country was too strong. He filed an appeal to get his job back. In the courtroom, Roman had a solid case. Not only was he a respected local mathematician, but his time in the U.S. had also established him as an influential scholar. But to his disbelief, his appeal was denied because the judge in charge of his case was friends with one of the professors from the university. Not one to give up, Roman filed a second appeal. This time, the case landed in the hands of Judge Frank. Roman argued that the university had accused him of being an incompetent lecturer, but had failed to provide any solid evidence to back up their claims. Frank promised to handle the case fairly, giving Lucy a great deal of hope. But a few days later, the prosecutor presented what they claimed was new evidence, a petition signed by former students who stated that Roman lacked the necessary teaching skills. Roman immediately called it out as a fake. He requested that the students be brought in to testify, a request that should have been granted. But Frank, ignoring legal protocol, sided with the university and dismissed the appeal, ruling that Roman was indeed incompetent. Infuriated by the injustice, Roman decided to take matters into his own hands. On January 15, 2007, he went to Frank's apartment, a powerful crossbow in his hand. He planned to give the judge a lesson he'd never forget. He was later arrested for his actions. The incident made national headlines, and the motive was clear. Roman's anger over the court's biased ruling had finally boiled over, earning him a severe criminal charge. After her husband's arrest, Lucy began looking for a hotshot lawyer to take on Roman's case. She ended up choosing Brian, a former lawyer who had successfully defended a professor who was also unfairly fired from his university. At first, Brian was dead set against taking the case. Not only was Roman a disgraced academic, but he was also a suspect in an attempted murder case against the judge. But Lucy pleaded with him, telling him the whole story from the get-go. After hearing her out, Brian apologized, telling her that if he took the case, he wouldn't be able to give it his best effort. His manager, however, tried to convince him otherwise, saying that the case was a surefire way to get a ton of attention. He argued that if Brian won, he'd be a big shot, and if he lost, he'd still be a celebrity. But Brian didn't buy it, knowing there was no money in it for him. Turned out, Brian was once an activist lawyer, but since he had 2 kids and his wife was always nagging him for money, he had become a financially desperate lawyer who was just trying to make ends meet. The next day, Brian went to court to visit a lawyer friend of his and was given a fraud case. Since the judge in charge was an old school friend, it would be an easy win. He was given a down payment for the job, which helped ease his financial woes. As Brian was leaving, he saw Lucy in the hallway. He tried to duck out, but he decided to go to the courtroom where the hearing of Roman's case was being held. Brian watched as Judge Frank was questioned on the witness stand. The judge recounted the incident in front of the elevator, saying that a crossbow bolt had pierced his abdomen. He said that he had fought back, pulled the bolt out of his stomach, and handed the now bent bolt and blunt tip to his driver. Roman's lawyer then asked him how a bolt that was pulled out of someone's stomach could have a blunt tip. Frank stammered that he had no idea. Roman blew a gasket. He stood up and told the court that Frank was a liar. He was so frustrated with his lawyer that he took over the questioning, bringing up the previous trial that Frank had presided over. He accused the judge of not upholding the principles of truth and integrity. The new judge immediately shut him down, telling him that his questions were not relevant to the case at hand. But Roman pushed back, arguing that the court's unfair decision was the reason he was standing there today. He was so furious that he objected to the entire proceeding and then fired his lawyer on the spot. Meanwhile, Brian noticed a reporter sitting next to him and realized that it was his old high school friend June. After the hearing, they agreed to grab a drink. At that moment, June asked why he turned down Lucy. Brian tried to justify his decision not to take the case, saying that only a total idiot would shoot a judge with a crossbow. Just then, his phone rang. It was his friend who told him that the fraud case had been canceled. His friend also demanded the down payment back, which sent Brian into a total meltdown. He was so upset that he didn't dare go home to his wife, so he ended up getting a cheap motel room for the night. The next day, Lucy met with a group of supporters who saw Roman as a hero, a man who had the guts to stand up to a crooked legal system. They all agreed that his current lawyers were a complete joke, and that he needed someone who could go toe-to-toe with the prosecution and the judges. Naturally, June, who was also present there, immediately thought of Brian. Lucy said she wasn't a fan of his drinking habit, but she was at her wit's end, and they had no other choice. June managed to talk Brian into a meeting with Roman by reminding him that he had no clients. During the meeting, Roman told Brian that he was sick and tired of his previous lawyers telling him to apologize and show remorse for something he didn't do. Brian was baffled. It was a well-known fact that Roman had shot the crossbow at the judge, but Roman dropped a bombshell. He never actually shot the crossbow. He said he understood the law. He saw it as a precise science, just like mathematics. According to him, the law in South Korea was a masterpiece, but the judges and lawyers were misusing it. He wanted to show them that he was a genius who could use the law to his advantage. Brian was a little taken aback. He realized that Roman was an idealist and that their mindsets were light years apart. He told him he couldn't take the case and left. June was bummed out. Brian was back to his old drinking habits. He told her that a man like Roman didn't need a lawyer. He needed a miracle. Just then, his boss, Greg, called and told him he had to be in court in the morning. June, feeling bad for him, decided to let him sleep off his drunken stupor in the car. The next morning, she drove him to the courthouse, where Greg was waiting. As they were having coffee while waiting for Brian, Greg told June that Brian had once been a legal hero, a true activist. But after a labor protest in 2001, he had changed. He had been a champion for the workers' rights, but had been caught in the middle of a clash with the police. He was nearly beaten to a pulp, but was saved when he was recognized as a lawyer. After that, he became a total mess and started drinking heavily, blaming himself for what happened to the workers. Greg then showed her a recording of Brian leading the protest, a powerful display of his compassion for the common people. One morning, Greg woke Brian up and gave him a reality check. He told him that if he didn't start taking on clients, he would have to sell their office. He told him that the only way to save their practice was to take on Roman's case. After a lot of soul-searching, Brian finally went back to see Roman in jail and told him he had a change of heart. He was going to be his lawyer. He cut right to the chase and asked Roman why he had brought a crossbow in the first place. Roman explained that he had no intention of killing anyone. He was just so fed up with the legal system's BS that he had been letting off steam at a shooting range. The whole point of going to Frank's apartment was just to scare him, to teach him a lesson for his foolish ruling. Brian knew he had a mountain to climb, but he began his work anyway. He spent hours and hours taking notes, listening to Roman lay out his case, and the two of them came to an understanding. Brian wouldn't change anything that Roman had already written. A short time later, the first appeal hearing was underway. Brian laid out his case, arguing that the whole trial had been rigged from the start. He said that the public was well aware that the judges had all conspired to make the incident look like an act of terrorism to the judiciary. This meant that no matter which judge presided over the trial, the verdict was already set in stone. He demanded a fair trial and the opportunity to present his own witnesses and evidence. But the prosecutor wasn't having any of it. He said that a man who attacked a judge, the last bastion of democracy, should be punished, not given a platform. He argued for a 4-year prison sentence and reminded the court that if the appeal failed, the sentence could be even harsher. Still, Brian's fierce defense won over the hearts of Roman supporters, who were thrilled to see their hero finally get a lawyer who was willing to fight for him. On December 10, 2007, the second appeal hearing began. Brian requested that Frank be brought back to the witness stand, arguing that he was the key witness in the case. The prosecutor then showed a piece of evidence, a shirt stained with what they claimed was Frank's blood. Brian asked to have the shirt tested, which was a fundamental forensic procedure. The judge was about to deny the request, but Roman, with his legal savvy, jumped in and told the judge that the correlation between the evidence and the facts had to be proven. Brian immediately backed him up, saying that a simple blood test was a no-brainer. But the prosecutor objected, saying that it wasn't necessary because the hospital had already confirmed the injuries. Roman then dropped another bombshell, saying that the wound was not from the crossbow bolt. The prosecution had originally presented a broken crossbow bolt as evidence, but then replaced it with a whole one. The judge, seeing all the facts laid out in front of him, agreed to consider the request. He also agreed to summon 4 new witnesses: the officers who collected the evidence, the officer who reported the incident, the paramedics, and the doctor who had treated Frank. After the hearing, Lucy thanked Brian for his patience with her husband. She knew he was a difficult person to handle, but Brian had done a bang-up job. The third appeal hearing kicked off on January 28, 2008, and Brian came out swinging. The first witness to take the stand was a paramedic. He testified that when he and the driver first arrived on the scene, Frank came out of the apartment building on his own, holding his stomach. When he was in the ambulance, the paramedic asked him how he got the wound. According to the paramedic's notes, Frank said that Roman had shot a crossbow at him and that the arrow had ricocheted off his body. After hearing that bombshell, the prosecutor had no follow-up questions for the paramedic, even though the judge gave him the green light. Next up was the doctor who had treated Frank. He testified that the wound was so serious that it required 3 weeks of care. Brian then pulled out the paramedic's notes, which showed the initial wound depth was 0.5 centimeters. He pointed out to the court that the hospital's diagnosis listed the wound as 2 centimeters deep. The doctor quickly claimed that the 2-centimeter measurement was for the wound's width, not its depth, and that it was difficult to accurately measure a wound's depth. Brian had just thrown a major wrench in the prosecution's case, and the doctor had no good answer for him. The next witness was the police officer who had collected the arrows from the crime scene. The officer's testimony was completely at odds with his written report. He stated that he had found and collected 3 whole arrows in front of the door. Brian then asked him, based on the driver's testimony, that he had put a broken arrow and 2 whole ones on the ground if he had collected the broken one. The officer's answer was an absolute shocker. He said no. Roman and Brian were both ready to jump out of their chairs. Roman accused the prosecutor of tampering with the evidence and demanded that the broken arrow be brought in. Next on the witness stand was the detective who had collected Frank's clothes. Brian asked him to confirm that the clothing was indeed what Frank had been wearing. He then pointed out an odd detail. The undershirt had a blood stain, but the dress shirt over it did not. The detective tried to explain it away, saying that maybe the blood had not soaked through, but Brian immediately shut him down, showing the court that the jacket over the dress shirt had a blood stain on it. The detective was left completely speechless. The prosecutor, having no more witnesses, said they were done. But Roman wasn't having it. He stood up and, in a moment of pure drama, asked the prosecutor why they weren't cross-examining the witnesses. He argued that the witnesses' testimony proved that Frank was a liar and that the prosecution was now tacitly admitting to his innocence. The judge tried to shut him down, saying that it was his job to decide and that he would give his verdict later. But Roman was fed up with the judge's vague answer. He wanted a straight answer from the prosecutor right then and there. The judge, tired of Roman's antics, ordered the prosecutor to answer. The prosecutor once again said that they had enough evidence. Roman then dropped the final bombshell. If the prosecutor was satisfied with the evidence, then the witnesses had confirmed that all the evidence was fake, which meant either Frank had injured himself or the prosecutor had fabricated the evidence. The judge, in a fit of rage, told Roman to stick to the court procedures. The judge then delivered a final, infuriating blow. The request for a blood test was denied because, according to him, a sample of the victim's blood could not be obtained. Brian was beside himself. He couldn't wrap his head around how a court could deny a simple medical test. The judge coldly told him that the examination was improper, a statement that earned a few snickers from the audience. Brian kept pushing back, demanding to know how a court couldn't issue a warrant for a simple blood test. But the judge had had enough and cut him off, denying the request once and for all. That's when Roman jumped in. With all the legal knowledge he had, he delivered a powerful monologue. He argued that the witness's testimony clearly contradicted the evidence presented by the prosecution, a direct violation of Article 152. He accused Judge Frank of perjury, a serious crime in and of itself. He then demanded that the judge on the stand take action. The judge, in a fit of rage, told Roman that he had no authority to make such demands, but Roman wouldn't back down. He insisted that the judge listen to him and demanded that a verdict be delivered at the next hearing. After the hearing, Roman filed a constitutional appeal, stating that the denial of the blood test was a violation of his right to a fair trial. After the trial, before getting on the prison bus, He told June, the reporter, that the whole trial was a complete circus. June's reporting, which was now all over the news, was a major turning point in the case. The public was now on Roman's side, with netizens creating a petition for his release. Rallies were held outside the courthouse in support of him. But just when things were looking up, they got a piece of bad news. The judge in charge of the case stepped down. They celebrated for a moment, thinking that he had a guilty conscience. But they soon realized that they were back to square one. The court was not going to give up. June soon found out that top court officials had held a meeting and decided to take drastic action. A new judge, Jonathan, was assigned to the case. He was known for being a real hardball, a no-nonsense man who had no time for nonsense. This meant that the case would be even tougher, but Roman was ready for it. The fourth appeal hearing kicked off on February 25, 2008, with a brand new judge, Jonathan, at the helm. He wasted no time in making his presence known, announcing that the trial would be conducted without any note-takers or audio recordings. Brian tried to fight back, immediately requesting a blood test, but Judge Jonathan shut him down in a flash, denying the request without a second thought. Frustrated by the judge's cold and unyielding attitude, Roman took over, using his legal expertise to expose the corruption. He pointed out that while the police report claimed that he had voluntarily turned over the crossbow and arrows, the truth was that the items had been confiscated. He argued that the official police report was fake, which was a serious felony. He asked Judge Jonathan if he was aware of this, and the judge went completely silent. Roman wasn't going to let it go. He took Judge Jonathan's silence as a sign of agreement and demanded that the judge take action against the officers for fabricating evidence. When Judge Jonathan refused to do his job, Roman dropped a major bombshell. With his voice ringing out in the courtroom, he said he would sue the judge. The entire courtroom gasped. It was unheard of for a defendant to sue a sitting judge. Roman, now in the driver's seat, used his knowledge of the law to put Judge Jonathan on the defensive. He used specific articles and statutes to prove his case, and for the first time, a judge had lost his composure. Roman's legal genius had him a step ahead of everyone in the room. The judge, who had been completely blindsided by Roman's audacity, immediately called for a break. Brian was left to pick up the pieces, but his request to bring Frank back to the stand was denied. After the hearing, Brian cornered Roman. He told him that while his actions in the courtroom were brilliant, they were hurting their chances of winning the case. He said that the key to winning was to get Frank back on the witness stand and expose him as a liar. That night in jail, Roman's life took a hard turn for the worse. He was moved to a new cell with 2 other prisoners. As he was trying to sleep, the biggest one of the 2 prisoners ordered him to get up and give him a massage. Roman flat out refused, and as a result, he was brutally beaten. This was just the beginning of his torment. Every day he was tormented and even sexually abused by the 2 prisoners. A week later, Roman was finally allowed to have visitors. Brian, Lucy, and June were horrified to see that his face was black and blue, and he had completely lost his will to fight. After hearing his story, Brian was furious and wanted to sue the head of the prison, but he knew there was nothing he could do. The other day, Brian took a crossbow to a shooting range to see for himself if the arrow could pierce a target. It did, and it went in deep. He then shot the arrow off target, and just as a police officer had said in the hearing, the arrow bounced off the wall with a bent shaft and a blunt tip, which was what Frank's driver had reported. On March 10, 2008, the 5th appeal hearing was underway. Roman couldn't attend because of his injuries, so the trial focused on the cross-examination between the prosecutor and Brian. Brian presented a sergeant who had tested the crossbow. The sergeant testified that he had to use perfect aim to get the arrow to stick to the target. He then said that it was impossible for a person to be injured by an arrow that had been shot incorrectly. To back up his claim, Brian showed the court a video of his reenactment. He wanted the court to know what had really happened, but Jonathan immediately denied his request, stating that he had enough evidence from the prosecutor and that there was no need to see the video. He then scheduled the last hearing. Brian was beside himself. He knew the judge was giving him a raw deal. After the hearing, Brian spoke in front of the journalists. He was going to say what he couldn't say in the courtroom. He told the reporters that Frank had been hiding the truth and that the prosecutor had been helping him. He argued that the missing arrow was proof that Frank had been lying. He then distributed copies of the video to the reporters, hoping that they would show the public the truth. Brian made it clear that Roman had not shot Frank and that the missing arrow was evidence that Frank had been lying all along. Thanks to Brian's tireless efforts, Roman was finally out of the hellhole he had been in. They couldn't sue the head of the prison, but at least the guy was in the shadows. too scared to show his face. Brian then learned that Judge Jonathan was trying to close the case, but the arrow test results had to be discussed. To make things even better, he was expecting the media to back him up. In a shocking turn of events, June's boss told her that she had to drop the story. The court was putting pressure on them, and her boss was afraid that it would cause problems for the company. June couldn't believe her ears. Meanwhile, Brian was getting ready to watch the news, expecting to see his story all over the media. He was disappointed to see that no one was covering the story. He started calling other reporters and found out that all of them had been pressured by the court. Brian was heartbroken. He had been counting on the media to help him fight Jonathan, but they had all abandoned him. June was so furious that she almost quit. Brian, seeing that he had no one else to turn to, decided to fight to the end. He called his wife and told her that he was going to make a scene in court and that he was probably going to jail. He told her to take care of the kids while he was gone. The last appeal hearing was a disaster from the get-go. Brian demanded that his video be played, but Judge Jonathan, being the no-nonsense judge that he was, refused to do so. Roman was livid. He stood up and, in a moment of pure drama, accused the judge of being biased and just left the hearing. Brian then walked out following Roman, hoping to stop the trial, but the court didn't care. They said they would just get a state lawyer to take his place and continue the trial. Brian had no other choice but to go back in, knowing that the trial was a sham. The prosecutor, in a shocking move, admitted that the evidence against Roman was full of holes. He conceded that the crossbow had not been given by Roman, but had been confiscated. He also said that the broken arrow was nowhere to be found, and he had no idea why the dress shirt had no blood on it. It was clear that the prosecution had no case, but Judge Jonathan refused to listen. Brian begged him to let him cross-examine Frank, but the arrogant judge once again denied his request. Brian then made a final, powerful statement, arguing that what Roman did was not a brutal crime, but a symbolic act of defiance against a corrupt system. But Judge Jonathan didn't care. He was going to close the case, and the audience was furious. They started yelling insults and throwing rotten eggs at the judge. Brian almost threw a water bottle at Jonathan, but was stopped by June. Jonathan, ignoring the chaos, ordered the prosecutor to give his final statement. He demanded a 4-year prison sentence. Brian, in a final act of defiance, said that none of the evidence proved Roman was guilty. He argued that the court's only goal was to protect its own authority. He said that the South Korean legal system was a joke and that Roman was not a threat to the country, but the system was. The appeal was denied, but Brian was not giving up. He planned to take the case to the Supreme Court. Roman was sentenced to 4 years in prison. He wasn't giving up. He wrote a petition stating that if a judge was involved in a case, another judge should not be allowed to preside over it. Roman thanked Brian and told him that he was ready to serve his sentence to expose the corruption of the South Korean legal system. In Ansan prison, Roman refused to be humiliated by the guards. He lectured them about human rights and the law, and in the end, the guards were afraid of him. Roman proved that a man of principle could never be defeated. 4 years later, Roman was released from prison. He continued his fight against the corrupt judiciary of South Korea as a public lawyer for laborers.